lytter til Københavns Universitets seneste forsøg på at forklare verden. Sammen undersøger vi, hvad vi ved, hvad vi ikke ved, og hvad vi diskuterer endnu. Velkommen til Verden forsøgt forklaret.
Mathias, I just walked from home on Amager to this wonderful library, and I probably passed around 4, 5, 6 of the things we're going to speak about today: sculptures, monuments, kind of public artworks. I just went past them. When you go through the city of Copenhagen or any city in the world, and you pass those monuments, how do you see them?
Now, over the last couple of years, I have worked specifically on monuments. So now, if I walk with friends or my partner, everyone is annoyed with me because I stop everywhere and ask questions. But if you had asked me maybe like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whether I would work on public monumental sculptures, that I have walked past things for a long time as well. Because in art history, for many years, monuments have been looked upon as quite boring things. The French poet Charles Baudelaire wrote a text in the 1860s called "Why Monuments Are Boring," or "Why Sculptures Are Boring." And that's kind of been a bit it often, because they're there, all around us. We're so used to them that often we don't really see them and look at them, but they're still there and they have a presence. And I'm interested in that presence and what it does. Also, when that presence isn't necessarily clear to us what it says or what kind of relation that is. So now, I do have a tendency to be extremely conscious about everything. The bus that we passed on the way in here, there's one in the corner. I find kind of monuments and sculptures like mushrooms that kind of pop up when you start looking for them. But it hasn't always been like that.
This is what we'll try to do tonight, to make those monuments that are basically dead material, stone or copper or whatever. We'll try to make them speak, and we'll try to look back and see how they are connected to our history, to our memories, and how kind of our views are changing on them. You said 10 years ago you passed the monuments like I did today or normally do. What changed your view on monuments at the time?
I think when I started as an art historian and as a student, I was interested in everything that was excluded from art history and from kind of mainstream stories. I came in art history, I was active in the kind of queer activist movement, and I was interested in and learned a lot from feminist art history and queer art history. And I wasn't really interested in all the presences, all the white men on horses or pedestals.
Kings and princes.
Yes. I was more interested in everything in the corners and the dark rooms and the bars and stuff that was used and important to people, but not necessarily for the people in power. So that was kind of what I was studying, and started as a scholar. That was where my focus was really directed at. But then you also get interested in, certain things have gotten presence. They are there. Why are all these sculptures there? Why is the canon, the historical importance, those values? Who decided it? What are the structures that keep something in place? Why is that just not really talked about, even though it has such a kind of impact on how we just walk through the city, even though you don't necessarily know who it is and recognize it? It's there. You have to orient yourself around it. You might just kind of sit and lean against it, or you might, people pee upon it, or birds shit on it. Of course, it has different importance to people, but it's there and it is massive. And so I guess I've been interested in trying to understand that massive presence that we kind of ignore. But it grows out of an interest in power, I guess.
So if you should translate it, not everybody here in the audience is an art historian. If we look back and ask the art historian, those sculptures that we see in our cities, in our kind of open landscape, how would you say, what do they express? What do they represent? I mean, they are built in the past. What kind of is their expression? Who decided upon it? What do they represent? What kind of history do they tell us?
It depends where we are in the world, because monuments have been used different ways in different places. So I guess the tradition of putting up a statue in bronze or marble of usually great men has a long history in the antique world, in Greece, for instance.
And great men means powerful men.
Powerful men, but also, back in Greece 2,000 years ago, it could also be a great sportsman or
a thinker.
Yes, but then it kind of returns with big great force, that tradition in Europe specifically, in the Renaissance, but also in Denmark, that kind of tradition of erecting statues of people on a pedestal in public space starts basically in the 1680s, and it enters really with full force in the 1700s of the 18th century, during the absolute monarchy. So it's part of the propaganda program for the monarchy, the king. In Denmark, they borrow it from France. They're inspired by the French, Louis XIV. These monarchies around Europe at the time that are self-understood as the God's elected person on earth, and which is a structure and program where the figure of the real king, the human being, is a human, but it asserts itself as if it is God's chosen person on earth. And to get that monumentality, to get people to think and believe that the king is so important that you're not allowed to criticize him, because then your head will probably fall off. They need a machinery around to create that kind of pyramid scheme of power, and art is used as a very important tool for that.
So at the time, they were erected to manifest a power structure within society. So 2 of the statues I passed on my way from Amager to this library was, for example, I think it's Frederick VII in front of the parliament, and some meters ahead of that is Absalon, the bishop, two powerful men. So those statues were erected at the time to manifest the structure of society.
The funny thing is that those 2 are a bit later, because in a Danish context, just to kind of wrap that up, we have during the absolute monarchy, they kind of copy the idea of the Roman and the Greece antiquity. So they go back towards this image program that developed also during the Roman imperial rulers. So if you go to Amalienborg, the royal palace, there is a equestrian statue. Equestrian statue is a nice word for a man on a horse that is big. And
you look up.
And you look up, right? And that's from the 1750s by depicting Frederick V. And he is kind of in cosplay as Caesar. Like if you look at him, he's a Danish king, it's in Copenhagen, but he has slippers on, he looks like a Roman emperor. And of course that king, he was never in a battle, and he was never really in Rome, but so they looked upon to this image of power that was developed in antiquity, this imperialist, macho aesthetic. And they thought that this king, Frederick V, who was king between 1746 and 1766, he was not a very powerful human being. He was extremely alcoholized. He was drinking non-stop. He had a kind of a horrible relationship to women. And even like the people knew that this was not a body of a man that worked as a king. So you need to bolster the monarchy to create these images of someone who appears to be extremely powerful. And art was a good tool for that. And the image of kind of empirical power from the Roman antiquity was a vehicle to impress that. So that is kind of where it starts. Curious enough, though, a lot of the things you passed on your way and a lot of the statues that are outside this building, they're pretty recent. They're from the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century. Almost like the majority of works that you see is between 1880 and like 1920, a time where we actually have a democracy, where the kings are not that kind of absolute monarchs anymore.
So why were they put up at the time?
Yes, it is an interesting question, because you have, at least in Denmark, but also kind of across Europe, that you borrow this language of power. So even though the king in Denmark, when we got democracy in 1848-49, the king wasn't chosen by God anymore. He kind of became a human being, and then people got power. But almost all the statues of kings on horses we have, except these two early ones, they were made after we have a democracy. But still, we kind of replicate, we reproduce this image of the king. And I think it is because in Denmark, we didn't cut the head of the king like they did in France. In the French Revolution, they not only just beheaded the king, they also kind of beheaded all statues. So all the statues you see in Paris, basically, and around France now in bronze, they are not old. They are made recently to copies of the old ones, because they melted everything down, because they didn't want to have images of kings on horses. But Denmark, we didn't kill the king. We got the king to be like this figure of symbolic power.
Unity also?
Yeah. And I think to kind of say that, yes, the king could be there. The people are supposed to be in power. We don't want to kill the king. We make statues so the king doesn't feel like a small person. So it has a symbolic weight, but it isn't. So you can see that statue in front of the parliament is a bit different than the statues of kings on horses from the time where the kings were chosen by God and were kind of despots, right?
What is the function or the storytelling behind? Because at the time when you said the first statues were erected, there was to manifest some kind of power structure to really tell who's up and who's down. But when the after society erected those sculptures of earlier kings and powerful people, what was the idea behind this?
Well, you touch upon something important. That a lot of this.
I hope so.
A lot of the statues we see are of great men, and I say great men because that is almost 99% of the statues in public space in Denmark, and is of great in scare quote.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. It's even not only great men; it's great white men. Yeah.
Absolutely. And a lot of the statues that depict men now have been put up after the kind of the monarchy, the despotic history we have of kings who cannot be criticized. But they were put up in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, not 100 years ago approximately, in order for us to aspire to greatness. So they were put up as a kind of manifestation, not of power as the king, because in former times, in the 1600s and 1700s, the image of the king was the king. In part of why there are so many busts of kings and statues of kings, which is something we learned in Denmark from the French, was that the king might not be there because he might be drunk or something, but the image of the king does that work for you. So that was the former, it wasn't a portrait of someone. It was a manifestation of power. It was the king, just in another form. And of course, later on, that didn't really work. So a lot of those statues aren't, they do something else. They have a bit different function, but they have a function to memorialize people that society, we could say, right? But of course, there are just certain parts who are allowed to choose what to be put up because things cost money. That the society decides these are people that we need to remember. And that is basically the function of a lot of the statues, right? They are the people that apparently people think have done great work. We want to memorialize them, put them up in stone and bronze, so we remember their legacy. And that people, when we walk around and we gather around them, because a lot of these statues are placed in public space as a kind of central thing, something we need to gather around if we want to gather. That we both literally but also symbolically kind of gather around and look up towards them. That's why they have some big plinths, many of them. That you have a very kind of embodied relationship of humility and power. That someone stands up there and you need to look up to understand. and to think and maybe ask question, what did this person do? How can I do and be as great so somebody maybe in the future would like to make that of me as well?
Of course, times change, and we come back to this, but for example, today, I mean, we are also manipulated by pictures, by social media. We're kind of bombarded with images. You could say when we have a phone in front of us and we see the Kardashians or whatever, we might look up to their way of living as well. Were sculptures like images, like media at the time?
It's a good question. At least, you know, there's always been different forms of media circulation and image circulations. And of course, in the 19th century, 150 years ago, we started to have more kind of different forms of images, photography, etc. So whether it has had that function as social media today, I don't think so necessarily, but I do think it has had kind of visual presence in the city of importance, because we can see that there were more rituals perhaps connected to monuments before than now. And often monuments and statues and busts are kind of turned on and turned off in a way that usually they're kind of turned off. This is a concept or a way of speaking that Andrew Shanken, an architectural historian at Berkeley, speaks about, that, you know, often we just walked by like you did today. They were just kind of there. But then maybe at certain events, like the annual anniversary of a king's death, or at or the birthday of the person, you know, then we turned them on. We put wreaths of flower on them, or we gather around them for certain special occasions. And I think in the past we had more of those kind of cultural rituals connected to sculptures and monuments that we perhaps have forgotten a bit today, in part because there's just so much other things to do, and those men and those histories connected to them maybe don't necessarily have that same kind of attention or interest. They feel maybe outdated to a certain degree. So they're kind of turned off most of the time until maybe an activist or someone turned them on again by throwing painting on them, or paint on them, or actually kind of actualized to say, like, why is this colonial dude standing here in front of a church in Copenhagen? Like, what's that all about? So, so I think that kind of relationship of both kind of knowing who they are and then interacting with them maybe have had a more presence in a kind of a cultural life in the maybe 19th century than they have had over the last century or so.
We'll come back to what's problematic about it and what kind of changes in our viewpoint from today. I would like to stay in kind of the historic area just for a couple of more minutes, because it starts with kings and bishops, but then kind of the field of sculpture is widened. Business people come, thinkers come, and you also already talked about at some point of time we turned from an absolute or for a monarchy to a democracy. Is this widening of kind of sculptures to business people, kind of thinkers, kind of all different groups of society, a sign of democracy?
Okay, that's a good question. How to answer that properly? I think it is important at least to remember that a lot of, you know, the art world as we know it today, we talk a lot about the art world as a place of freedom and autonomy. Mm-hmm. Autonomy, also this beautiful word for something that can be done outside without influence of people in power, and so to speak. But of course the art world and the infrastructures of art, the art academies, the art museums, didn't start out as democratic institutions. They started out as kind of functional units, in partly as a propaganda machinery for the monarchy. That's how the French Art Academy started. That's how the Danish Art Academy was kind of founded in 1754. It was because the king and the monarchy, they needed artists that were able to produce art and produce busts and portraits of the king and distribute it kind of everywhere. And they didn't have infrastructure for that. They didn't have people who could make stuff in bronze. Bronze casting is extremely complex and extremely costly.
So you could say it was part of the king's propaganda machine.
But it was, really, it totally was. You can just, during Frederick V, who was one of my kind of favorite kings, is easy to kind of talk about because he was king during the time when the Danish colonial regime really expanded, but also when art was instrumentalized, because he was part of, or I say he, but he was kind of the people who were the real kings in the shadows, because he was just the figure who usually would be drinking more than reigning. But where they needed something to happen, so during kind of 20 years between 1746 and 1766, Copenhagen suddenly becomes, you get an infrastructure to create pictures of the king. So you have artists coming from abroad. You have an art academy that can teach new generations of artists based in Denmark to paint pictures, to create busts in bronze. You have bronze foundries that can cast bronze. You have people in marble that can work in marble coming from Italy. You have infrastructure of getting stones from Norway. Like Norway was emptied, my home country, of marble during the 18th century. And you get ivory getting in from the Danish colony in Africa. You have thousands of ivory tusks of elephant coming to Copenhagen because that's stuff the kings and princes used for leisure. Because in the world when you carve out of ivory these perfect mathematical, beautiful sculptures, that's the image of the king's ability to control the world. So you have all these things that are happening, and you get all these infrastructures of art collecting and art production is part of a kind of propaganda machine. And then when we get a democracy, it changes. It doesn't change that it doesn't have a function. Art history, the discipline that I'm trained in, just went over to not support the king, but support the people and the nation. So the first,
but they still get hired by rich people who kind of buy the sculptures.
They do, and of course there is the movement that more people have access to buying art. It's also a history of capitalism, right? It's of how people get more money, and in Denmark that is extremely closely connected to colonial history, because in the latest part of the 1700s, from 1750 until 1804, when the Brits bomb Copenhagen and everything kind of goes downhill economically. So many rich people who have investment in the trade from Copenhagen to the Danish colony in India, and in the trade port in China, and with enslaved people in Africa, and sugar industries, and the Danish-Norwegian colony in the Caribbeans. Suddenly, all these new people have money. And what do you do when you have money? You want to represent yourself in a good way. And how do you do that? Yes, you get artists to produce works that memorializes you and that represent you.
So today you take a selfie, and at the time you made a sculpture of yourself. Yeah,
and you can see that a lot of the people, the merchants in Denmark, in the 1750s, 60s, and onwards, they suddenly get money on their hands. And we have at that time in Denmark, and it's in all over Europe, it's an extremely class-based society, right? And it's been a society where you need to inherit wealth and inherit a title. So you're a count, or you're part of a system that is all about being born into it. Colonial capitalism, in a way, changes that because suddenly so many people who come out of all kinds of places have invested. They have been part of kind of horrible trade systems, but they get cash on their hands, and suddenly they have money to do the same things as the inherited people with wealth do, which is using art as a way to get up in the society. So Jens Juel, the famous Danish portrait painter, he paints all the kings all the time, but suddenly he paints all the plantation owners, all the merchants. But they don't paint themselves with like a plantation in the background. In the 15 to 1600s, it was kind of trendy to show that you could have enslaved people. A lot of portraits of Danish monarchs, but also other really, really wealthy countesses and stuff. They often included these extremely violent pictures of portraits of an enslaved boy, usually. But then when the rich merchants, they want to access society. They want to appear to be successful. So they get their portrait painted, but it's all neutral. You can never see where the money comes from.
Beautiful nature.
Yeah, they're just like, you know, beautiful backgrounds that are kind of one-colored. So you can't see the difference between if you have inherited money or you just got really, really, really rich from being from your plantation of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean with sugar money. So art is used in different ways. And when we come to democracy, art has really been used in service of a national narrative. So the establishment of art history as a scholarly discipline, we are now in a university library, right? And the establishment of national galleries. All of us researchers, we were then put to work for the story of the nation. And that was a happy story of the nation and a proud story. And colonialism was not part of that story.
So it's nation building and kind of telling some stories that combine society or kind of back up behind the nation.
And the history of how art has been used for many different purposes, but often as part of kind of larger projects, even the royal project or the project of kind of legitimizing, repairing to be a successful, not necessarily showing how you became successful. That process of using art as a way of being visible, as a way of entering into history, entering into kind of a cultural sphere of influence. Of course, that's still going on. It's still, in order to get a portrait of yourself, busts are still being produced all the time, even though a lot of us who work with contemporary art might find it often to be a bit old-fashioned, but it's being produced, but it costs money. And the people who are being cast in bronze now, either they cast themselves because they are allowed to pay for it, or other people with power and money decide it. So some of those structures are still there. They're changing, and of course the world is different. But some of these infrastructures, the Art Academy, even though they are also changed, but their legacy has a way that is entangled with histories of colonialism, histories of patriarchal white supremacy. And those things are, of course, uncomfortable and not always talked about so much.
It seems then when we talked about sculptures, and you told us about when kind of why the kings kind of originally were built and to kind of manifest the structure in society, that's a kind of art historian way of looking upon things. And you can see, like, reading paintings from different periods, you can see, okay, this is a Baroque painting, this is a Renaissance painting, style changes through the years, then you have the 20th century modernism, all that. So you can put words on it, you can categorize things. Like you can with sculptures, and then I can say, we can today say, well, in the 18th century it was kings, and then in the 19th century we did sculptures of business people because we were into democracy. There were not many women, but women didn't have the right to vote at the time. So it's kind of a sign of the times. It's that there were, but it seems that today we think this kind of categorization is problematic, because you already mentioned, like, to produce sculptures, we cannot any longer kind of forget the colonial aspects so we go from kind of a descriptive mode or a scientific mode into something that has with moral or kind of redefinition. What is happening? Why do we suddenly do not accept history as history anymore, but think that the way we have told histories is suddenly problematic? I know that's a quite big question.
No, but it's a great question, and it's important because it touches upon things that is important to people, why people get engaged by monuments. But maybe to start with the word history, because both in English and in Danish, that term is a bit slippery, because we use it for two different things. When we talk about history, sometimes we refer to things that happened in the past, like a socio-historical process. Like, that's history, like the past. And other times we use it to talk about the story about that past, the way we narrate that past. So when people,
the storytelling.
The storytelling. which is two quite different things. Because one thing is the past. The past is lost, or it happened. That's why it's not here anymore. History, as I use it, that's the narrative we tell about that past. And that past was, every past is enormously complex, right? Like 6 billion people have different experiences of that past, and hundreds of, the narrative we tell about that past is, of course, an extremely tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of all the different experiences, all the different things that is put into a narrative that can be coherent so we can understand it. And of course, that perspective that we have told those stories from and through, or organized it, has often been, history is about monarchies, for instance, the royal history, or the history of the people, or the prime ministers, or biographies, right, as a way to tell histories. And so when people are now talking about, that if we remove a monument or criticize it, then we're like removing history. It's like, no, we don't remove history. Like the past is kind of gone, but history, the way we tell about the past, that is always in movement. It would always change. And that's not a controversial thing to think that history changes. Just the fact that, like if I realize that an artist that I've written about, I've written the wrong name of the birth of that person, of course I will update it. That doesn't ruin the history. I just make the history more precise, right? And I think a lot of what we art historians and other scholars do is that, of course, we all the time update history. We change history because we have more perspectives, we learn more, we get wiser, we realize that that was maybe not a good interpretation. Maybe those weren't the best perspectives to select out of all the different perspectives. Maybe it is important not only to listen to what the king or the person in power, but also like, what did the maid have to say about that period, or what did the worker have to say, right? That's why the field of history and the field of art history is never set. It lives because we ask more questions, we find out new material. So in one way, I think at least it's important to say that, history will always change. And that is a good thing, but it's also a condition, because the narrative we tell will have to change. And monuments are not history. Like monuments have a history, like you can tell the history of how they were built and who did what, and so. But when we talk about, moving a monument, saying that we're destroying history, is like, no, because a monument is usually a horrible storyteller. Like a monument is kind of a point of reminding us of a certain perspective that we need to remember and look up to. But like you walk past all these monuments, what do you really learn about that king from walking past that, except for that he's big, that he's tall, that he's an extremely expensive bronze, that he is powerful, right? But except for that, the monument doesn't usually say a lot in itself. It isn't a good pedagogical tool for telling the story of what happened in the past, usually.
Yeah, and maybe, you told before that at one point of time, kind of all those monuments and sculptures, they went into this storytelling of the nation. And again, when we look at them today and when we kind of pass them and are conscious about them, it has to do with our memory. So some of the stories that were told of the time are still part of our teaching in school and our kind of consciousness about our history and also the history of the nation. So how would you say, does history and memory, storytelling of the nation and our memory of the nation, how do they how are they connected?
I think at least in terms of monument, we need to understand them as tools. They're instruments for memory. Inge Adriansen, the Danish cultural historian, she writes about kind of monuments as the punctuation, like ideological punctuation marks in society. Yeah. And often I think monuments are like an exclamation mark, like, look at this, remember this, and as a portal to tell stories. So it's a tool we use to talk about, for instance, kings, because they're there. You might not know anything about it, but if you have a guided tour of the city, it's a great opportunity to say, like, oh, who is this? You might ask, question mark. and then people can talk about it. So it's a tool that we use for something. And those uses can have different functions, and they can take different forms. And it's then also interesting what does the monument serve for us? What potentials? So outside of close to the horse you went by, you also probably went by a statue of Christian IV.
The new one.
The new one. It's
Yes.
from 2018, made by Hans Pauli Olsen. It shows Christian IV sitting on a plinth of 3 buildings that he was part of commissioning.
Yeah, the Round Tower.
The Round Tower, the Stock Exchange that burned. He's standing in front of the Stock Exchange. And then Rosenborg Castle. They're inverted, so we can talk about the aesthetics in a different podcast. But this is from 2018. And it was put up by a committee of politicians and businessmen who wanted us to memorialize Christian IV. He's a king in the late 1500s, early 1600s, right, when the Danish colonial empire starts. But they said in the opening speech, you can always learn a lot from listening to speeches at reveals, that they wanted to make a statue of the king. We already have 3 statues of him in Copenhagen, but in order to remember him as the creator of arts and aesthetics. Because now we've had a feminist critique of him for 50 years. He was the one responsible for the witch hunts and the witch trials. And this committee of men, they thought that he had gotten a bad reputation. Mm-hmm. So they wanted a reputation so tourists could come and see the parliament and see Christian IV as this, the one who built the aesthetic Renaissance architecture of Copenhagen.
And they got the Queen to introduce the monument at the
Queen unveiled it, and the Queen, her private orchestra. It was a big event. And I'm interested, what does that tell us? It tells us at least that as a monument, it isn't a good storyteller as such, because it doesn't show any complexity of Christian IV. It doesn't have a dead woman underneath him or like a fire with, it has 3 certain things. So there's a very curated selection of what perspectives on that past that we will walk by and that a guide can talk about. If it, of course, had been like a fire underneath and some dead witches or women, that would be a different monument, probably, right? And maybe not so helpful and fun for that guide who wants to tell a happy story of Renaissance architecture and the arts and how the monarchy has been patrons of the arts in this positive way. So monuments often have, they're very selective perspectives. They're often extremely idealized. Mm-hmm. We talked about that, Frederick V, all of this monuments to him, the statues of him. Probably he was not even the model for it, but his apothecarist, because he was a bit prettier and he probably had time. At least an art historian has argued that I think almost all the portraits of the king, probably even the statues of the king, are not modeled after the king, but his apothecarist, because he looked like him.
An idealized version.
His idealized version, right. And so monuments are often idealized exclamation points of things to remember and look at. And as such, they are not great storytellers, but they're instruments in how we tell stories. And often, if you want to tell complex stories that gives room for different perspectives, that the monument as a form doesn't necessarily serve that very well, because it is often white men on a big high up there. It's not necessarily the complexity of the people, of all the relations that go into creating a society, right? So
now I ask you, if I was the Minister of Culture and I would invite you as my advisor, I would say, obviously, Mathias, we have some blind spots within our kind of sculptural history. We should have more women, we should have more queer people, we should have more colored people. And there are many questions there. First of all, you say sculptures maybe not an ideal mode to tell a story. But then, of course, you and I may have different views on kind of the blind spots. So how do we as a society, cope with monuments today, and the blind spots, and the untold stories, and the problematic stories like the colonial histories? And so what do we do about it?
I think the really important thing is that we dare to have conversations, and honest conversations, about monuments in public space. And that we actually have a conversation about why they are there, how they got up there, and who decided it. In a Danish context, almost all the statues that we see in parks and public spaces, a lot of them came up because of one brewer, Jacobsen, the Carlsberg Brewery, right? He had this program called Albertina, where he donated enormous amount of money to create monuments in bronze, partly copies of antique sculptures. You can see that in Ørstedspark, in a park close to here. And a lot of money to create monuments by great scientists and other great kind of men in Denmark at the time, in order for both the people to learn aesthetics, to understand what is beautiful, hence the antique sculptures, and to aspire to become great men, hence all the statues of men. So almost all the statues you see is basically decided by one man and his money, and that is the public sculpture park we have in terms of monuments of people. And I think it is important to have a conversation about, is that one man's desires and tastes and understandings of what is important? How long is that
representative? Yeah.
Because it wasn't as if there were monuments everywhere before. And I think we should be open to the fact that monuments are always on the move. They move materially, they degrade. In order to keep them up, it needs continual maintenance. And that costs money. And right now we have a lot of private foundations that spend a lot of money on making monuments appear permanent. Because monuments aren't permanent. They degrade all the time. So I think we need to have a conversation about about the investment to keep a certain aesthetic appear permanent. And I think we need to also
just to make this clear, when you restore a sculpture, you use resources that you also could use to make a new sculpture.
To make new sculptures. But also they move around often. That's not a dramatic thing that has happened all the way through history. And I think we might also be able to have an honest conversation about maybe it's time for some of these sculptures of men to get a rest, to rest a bit, to cool down in an archive or a museum or somewhere, so it's room for other things. Because if the cultural minister, he wants to get more access or more visibility to representations of great women, which is this program. But of course, all the squares are already crowded by men. So if we were to have any kind of balance, which I think is difficult, and we can talk about whether that is desirable to have just more of the same kind of sculpture, just with different forms. That will just be the corners that are available right now, in a way. Like these weird, because all of the big squares are already packed with representations of white men. So I think we need to have a conversation about maybe it's time to, get people to move a bit. I don't think that is a dramatic thing. It's not about erasing history, because monuments have always moved. But it might create a space for us to talk about collectively how do we want to have the spaces where we are able to meet and gather up? Do we want to always gather around certain individual figures? Or do we maybe want to also give space for artists that have done enormous amount of work to rethink how the relationship between the body and people and space and sculptures, to create other forms and formats? Maybe that we don't meet around a big famous person, but that where we can gather together and look at each other and converse and talk. And I think that's where artists have done such an important work over many, many decades, to open up other kind of question of how art doesn't necessarily need to be used as an instrument for the same way of storytelling, maybe replacing certain subjects with other subjects, like men with women. I would love to have more statues of women. I'd love to have more kind of crazy art in the public. But I think we need to have a conversation about why does it look the way it is? What are the structures that have shaped and that keep shaping the present? And how can we have a conversation not only about kind of a post-it with some more women, but to actually to dare to talk about these things more.
So many interesting aspects, so many questions still to ask, but thank you very much for now. And you said, let's have a conversation. We'll open up the conversation now for you. But until now, thank you very much, Mathias.
What's going on with the institutions and foundations that spend enormous amount of resources renovating and keeping those monuments up to speed and make them look like we just put them up yesterday? Is there any research into this, or are you just making assumptions?
Well, we are in the research project that I run, Moving Monuments. We do quite a lot of research on trying to map the infrastructures of maintenance. And of course, a lot of the art that you see outside in public space is difficult to know the ownership of it, which means that we don't have a database in Denmark of everything, all the statues you see in public, which is something what the Minister of Culture wants to create now, because that's why we can't really say how many statues of named women are there. We don't know. Why? Because a lot of the art that is out there is either made by the state and either by the municipality, a lot of it by private foundations, and some also they're just kind of ended up gifted or something, right? So the responsibility of what is there is distributed kind of unevenly and differently. So when we talk about public art, a lot of it is really private, right? As we talk about public space, a lot of public space is really privately owned by someone. So hence the maintenance question is also very diverse. A lot of the big kind of historical monuments is maintained by the Agency for Palaces and Culture, so the Cultural Ministry. And they don't have a lot of budgets for it. So they have to fund a lot of the work they do by private foundations. And there is a certain kind of transparency on that, because foundations usually would like to show that they have spent money on it. So you can take the equestrian statue of Frederick V at Amalienborg Castle. A lot of you have probably been there. It's the castle where the king and queen lives. That monument in itself has been renovated for an enormous amount of money over the last 20 years. 17 million kroner has been paid by Appe Møller Foundation alone to change the marble, only the marble twice, because over the years it had been degraded, and then they changed it, and then it became yellow really quickly. It looked as somebody had peed on it, and they need to do it again because there was some metal inside. And so, of course, now it looks as if it is new, but that is kind of privately funded. It was a gift to the Queen by Max McKinney Møller for the former queens. So it's not always easy you need to quite do some digging and research in how and why. But it's also why when contemporary artists, for instance, want to create a monument to put up. We've had an important case in Copenhagen with Jeanette Ehlers and Lavon Bell, two artists who made a monument to the first monument to resistance against Danish colonial history, a monument called I Am Queen Mary, which was erected in 2018 outside of the West Indian Warehouse, the Copenhagen waterfront. They came out of kind of nowhere from a structure that is not used. It was just artists wanted to insert something into the public space and into the conversation. It was not a foundation behind it. It wasn't ordered or commissioned by the state or the municipality. And it's been enormously difficult for them to realize that piece because of that, because it doesn't fit into the established kind of infrastructure. And also that work, which is now just the base that is left, 2 tons of coral from the Danish former colony, Danish West Indies, the U.S. Virgin Islands, is there. The artists pay themselves to clean it because there's been so much kind of activist work from the right wing towards that statue, right? So there's not automatic structures in place to clean monuments, and those structures is something else I think we talk too little about. We talk a lot about monument activism. We don't necessarily talk enough about what I call kind of maintenance activism that is often private in the state, that goes into upholding certain aesthetic cultures and let other disintegrate.
Thank you very much for an inspiring talk. I have a question about your view of the monument in the future, because you talked about the Christian IV statue. Every time I bike past it, my stomach hurts because I think it's such an embarrassing thing in like the city landscape. And why is that? I think about Walter Benjamin and his like his texts about the souvenir and like kind of like taking like meaning out of the Eiffel Tower because everyone can run around with the Eiffel Tower if they're in their like pocket. Is the monument something that we will see in the future? Is the monument worth of preserving and continuing as a thing in the city landscape, or is it just hollow? Could we like? I would think it like thinking about making a statue of our like a recent king. Our like would just be like I could never see that happen. Like it would be a catastrophe. What I don't know. My question might form itself, but what is your view on that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question and a difficult question to answer short. A lot of the monumental landscape we see that is still being set up, like that statue of Christian IV, is not necessarily only conservative in terms of aesthetic, but it's also conserving in terms of its function, right? So some of those monuments that are being put up that draw on a long history of aesthetic forms of the statuary monument in bronze on a plinth. The function is to conserve a certain perspective and value on the past, like that the monarchy has done great work to support the arts, as the Christian IV statue. When the cultural minister now wants to have more statue of women in bronze, as he said, on plinths, I think it shows to the fact that there is still a kind of dominant idea of how to memorialize kind of the society, that the collective idea of what forms that could take is often quite conservative, which is sad in a way, because artists have done so much work of creating alternative to that, to kind of disintegrating the monument, creating counter monuments and anti monuments, and taking things down from the plinth, using aesthetic forms to create places to meet and to gather and to be provoked and of course that is still being produced as well. So right now we have kind of both a kind of a classical tradition that is both being redone again and again and conserved and maintained, and then we have another tradition of artists who do experiments, and we also still in Denmark have private foundations that fund it. So in one way I'm kind of hopeful for the fact that I hope that artists experiment in the research, because I really think it's about kind of artistic research in thinking about how aesthetic is used to create space and forms that can do different things, that can make us remember different stories, that can give room for different voices, that gets kind of prioritized publicly as well. And right now I think we are lucky in a Danish context right now that we still have both a cultural ministry that gives money for arts. We're not like in the US, for instance, right now, where there's political investment in stopping everything that isn't in a kind of a classical aesthetic. If you saw President Donald Trump's recent paper on architecture, that every architecture needs to look like kind of the White House, neoclassicist aesthetics. We're not there, but I think we need to get artists' research and voices much more out, and to dare to be confronted with things that doesn't look like what we are used to when it talks to monuments.
Thank you very much for coming and for your participation. And thank you very much, Mathias, for enlightening us in the way you did. Thank you very much.
Thank you for great questions.
Du har lyttet til Verden forsøgt forklaret. En udsendelse fra Københavns Universitet, udviklet med støtte fra Novo Nordisk Fonden.